Unfortunately, the flight to the chief clerk seems completely to upset Gregor's father, who had remained relatively calm until now. For instead of running after the man himself, or at least not hindering Gregor in his pursuit, he sees in his right hand the walking stick that the chief clerk had left behind on a chair, together with the hat and greatcoat. Snatched in his left hand a large newspaper from the table, and began stamping his feet and flourishing the stick and the newspaper to drive Gregor back into his room. No entry for Gregor's evaluated. Indeed, no entreaty was even understood. However, humbly he bent his head. His father only stamped on the floor and moved loudly. Behind his father, his mother had torn open the window despite the cold weather, and was leaning far out of it, with her face in her hands, a straw draw set in from the streets to the staircase. The window curtains blew in. The newspaper on the table fluttered. Stray pages whisked all over the floor. Precisely, Gregor's father drove him back and hissing and crying, "Shoo!" like a savage. But Gregor was quite unpracticed in walking backwards. It really was a slow business. If he only had a chance to turn around, he could get back to his room at once. But he was afraid to expressing his father by his slowness. Of such a rotation at my moment, the stick in his father's hand might hit him a fatal blow on the back or on his head. In the end, however, nothing else was left for him to do, since, to his horror, he observed that in a moving backwards, he could not even control the directions he took. And so, keeping an anxious eye on his father all the time, over his shoulder he began to turn around as quickly as he could, which was in reality very slowly. Perhaps his father noted his good intentions, for he did not interfere except every now and then to help him in a maneuver from the distance with the point of the stick. If only he would have stopped making that unbearable hissing noise. It made Gregor quite lose his head. He had turned almost completely around when his hissing noise so distracted him that he even turned a little the wrong way again. But when at least his head was fortunately right in front of the doorway, it appeared that his body was too broad simply to get through the opening. His father, of course, in his present mood, was far from thinking of such thing as opening the other half of the door to let Gregor have enough space. He had merely fixed the idea of driving Gregor back into his room as quickly as possible. He would never have suffered Gregor to make the circumstantial presentation or preparation for a standing upon and perhaps slipping his way through the door. Maybe he was now making more noises than ever to urge Gregor forward, as if no obstacle impelled him and plead him. To Gregor, anyhow, the noise in his ears sounded no longer like a voice of the one single father. This was really no joke, and Gregor thrust himself, come what might, into the doorway. His fleck was quite bruised, horrid blotches squinted the white door. Soon he was struck fast and left to himself. Could not have moved at all. His legs on one side fluttered, trembling in the air. Those on the other were crushed painfully to the floor when from behind his father gave him a strong push which was literally a deliverance, and he flew far into the room bleeding freely. The door was slammed behind him with a stick, and then at least there was silence. Not until it was twilight did Gregor awake out of a deep sleep, more like a swoon than a sleep. He would certainly have waken up of his own score not much later, where he felt himself suddenly rest and well slept, but it seemed to him as if a fleeting step and a contagious shutting of the door leading into the hall had aroused him. The electric lights in the street cast a pale sheen here and there on the ceiling and the upper surface of the furniture. But down below, where he lay, it was dark, slowly awake, awkwardly trying out of his feelers, which he now first learned to appreciate. He pushed his way to the door to see what had been happening there. It left aside, felt like one single long, unpleasantly sent scar. He had actually to limp on his two rows of legs. One little leg, moreover, had been severely damaged in the course of that morning's events. It was almost a miracle that only one had been damaged. It trailed uselessly behind him. He had reached the door before he discovered what had really drawn him to it. The smell of food, for there stood a basin filled with fresh milk in which floated little sops of white bread. He could almost have laughed with joy, since he was now until hungrier than in the morning. And he dipped his head almost over the eyes straight into the milk. But soon in disappointment, he withdrew it again. Not only did he find it difficult to feed because of his tender left side, he could only fed with the palpitating collaboration of his whole body. He did not like the milk either, although milk had been his favorite drink, and that was certainly why his sister had set it there for him. Indeed, it was almost with repulsive that he turned away from the base and crawled back into the middle of the room. A white sauce that had thickened, some raisins and almonds, a piece of cheese that Gregor would have called uneatable 2 days ago, a dry roll of bread, a butter roll, a roll both with buttered and salted. Besides all that, she sat down again the same basin, into which she had poured some water, which was apparently to be reserved for his exclusive use, and with a fine tract knowing that Gregor would not eat in her presence. She withdrew quickly and even turned the key and let him understand that he could take ease as much as he liked. Gregor's legs all whizzed towards the food. His wound must have healed completely, Moreover, he felt so disability, which amazed him and made him reflect how, more than a month ago, he had cut one finger with a knife and had still suffered pain from the wound only the day before yesterday. I am less sensitive now, he thought, and sucked greedily at the cheese, which above all other edibles attracted him at once and strongly. One after another, with tears of satisfaction in his eyes, he quickly devoured the cheese and vegetables and the sauce. The fresh food, on the other hand, had no charms for him. He could not even stand the smell of it. Actually dragged away to some little distance the things he could eat. He had long finished his meal and was only lying lazily on the same spot when his sister turned the key slowly as a sign of him to the retreat. That roused him at once, although he was nearly asleep, and that he hurried under the sofa again. But it took considerable self-control for him to stay under the sofa, even for the short time his sister was in the room, since a large meal had swollen his body somewhat and he was so cramped that he could hardly breathe. Side attacks of the breathlessness afflicted him, and his eyes were starting a little out of his hand as he watched his unsuspecting sister sweeping to gather with the broom not only the remains of what he had eaten, but even the things had not touched, as if things are now of no use to anymore. And hastily shoveling it all into the bucket, which she covered with a wooden lead and carried away. Hardly she had turned her back when Gregor came from under the sofa and stretch and pull himself out. In this matter, Gregor was fed once in the early morning, while his parents and the servant girl were still asleep, and the second time after they had all their midday dinner, for then his parents took on a short nap, and the servant girl could not be sent out on some errands by his sister. Not that they would have wanted him to serve, of course, but perhaps they could not have borne to know about his feelings more than hasty. Perhaps too his sister wanted to spare him with such little anxieties, whatever possible, since they had quite enough to bear as it was. Under what pretext the doctor and the locksmith had been get rid on that first morning, Gregor could not discover, for since what he said was not understood by the others. It never struck any of them, not even his sister. He could not understand what they have said. And so whatever his sister came into his room, he had contact himself with the hearing her utter only but a sigh now and then, an occasional appeal to the saints. Later on, when he got a little used to the situation, of course, she could never get completely used to it. She sometimes threw in a remark which was kindly meant or could be interpreted. "Well, he liked his dinner today," she would say when Gregor had made a good clearance of his food. And what he had not eaten, which gradually happened more and more often, she would say, almost sadly, "Everything has been left standing again." But although Gregor could get no news directly, he overheard a lot from the neighboring rooms, and soon the voices were audible. He would run to the door of the room concerned and press his whole body against it. In a few days, especially, there were no conventions that did not referred to him somehow, not even if the only indirectly. For 2 whole days, there were no family consultations at every mealtime about what should be done, but also between meals and some subjects were discussed. For there were always at least 2 members of the family at home. Since no one wanted to be alone in the flat and no, to leave it quite empty was unthinkable. And on the very first of these days, the household cook, it was not quite clear what and how much she knew of the administration. Went down on her knees to his mother and begged leave to go. When she departed, a quarter of an hour later, gave thanks to her this meal with tears in her eyes, as if for the greatest benefits could have been conferred on her, and without any prompting swore a solemn oath that she would now never to say a single word to anyone about what had happened. Now Gregor's sister had to cook too, helping her mother. True, the cooking did not amount to much, for they eat scarcely anything. Gregor was always hearing one of the family vainly urging another to eat and getting no answer but thanks, I've had what I want, or something similar. Perhaps they drank nothing either. Time again, his sister kept asking his father if he wouldn't like some beer, or offered kindly to go to fetch it herself. And when he made no answer, suggested that she could ask for concierge to fetch it, so that he needed feel no sense of obliteration. But then around no came from his father, and no more was said about it. In the course of that very first day, Gregor's father explained the family financial position and prospects to both his mother and his sister. Now and then he rose from the table to get some voucher and memorandum out of a small save that he had rescued from the collapse of his business 5 years earlier. One could hear him opening the contemplated lock and rustling papers out of the shut-in again. This statement made by his father was the first cheerful information Gregor had heard since the imprisonment. He had been of opinion that nothing was left over from his father's business. At least his father had never said anything to the contrary. And of course, he had not asked him directly. At the time, Gregor's sole desire was to his utmost to help the family to forget as soon as possible to catastrophe that had overwhelmed the business and thrown them all into the state of complete despair. And so he had set to work with unusual ardor, and almost overnight had become a commercial traveler instead of a little clerk, which with of course much greater chances of earning money. And his success was immediately translated into good round coin, which he could lay on the table for his amazed and happy family. These had been fine times, and they had never recurred, at least not with the same sense of glory. Although later on Gregor had earned so much money that he was able to meet the expenses of a whole household, and did so. They had simply got used to it, both the family and Gregor. The money was gratefully accepted and gladly given, but there was no special a purge of warm feeling. With his sister alone, he had remained immature, and it was a secret plan of his that she, who loved music unlike himself and could play movably on the violin, should be sent next year to study the conservatorium, despite the great expenses that would entail, which most be made up in some other way. During his belief visit home, conversationum was often mentioned in the talks he had with his sister, but always merely as a beautiful dream which could not never come true. And his parents discouraged even these innocent references to it. Yet Gregor made up his mind firmly about it and meant to announce the fact there with due solemnity on Christmas Day. Such were the thoughts, completely fruitful in his parents' conditions, that went through his head, and as he still clinging upright to the door and listening. Sometimes out of a sheer weariness, he had given up listening and let his head feel neglectedly against the door, but he always had to pull himself together at once. For even the slight sound of his head made his audible next door and brought all the conversation to stop. What could he be doing now? His father would say after a while, absurdly turning towards the door, and only then would be interrupted conversation gradually be set and going again. Gregor was now informed as amply as he could wish, for his father tended to repeat himself in his explanations, partly because it was a long time since he had handled such matters, and partly because his mother could not always grasp things at once. That a certain amount of investment, a very small amount it was true, had survived the wreck of their fortunes and had even increased a little because the dividends had not been touched meanwhile. And besides that, the money Gregor brought home every month, he had kept only a few dollars for himself. It had never been quite used up for now amount, a small capitalism. Behind the door, Gregor nodded his head eagerly, rejoiced at this evidence of unexpected thrift and foresight. True, he could have really paid off some more of his father's debt to the chief with this extra money, and so brought such nearer the day on which he could quit his job. But doubtless, it was better than the way his father had arranged it.